The Parsha of Nitzavim is the Parsha that is always read in the week that precedes Rosh Hashanah. So this Shabbos we'll read Parsha of Nitzavim, and that's the Shabbos before Rosh Hashanah. And we will, as we study some aspects of the Parsha, we will come to see what is the significance. Why do we need to read this Parsha? There must be obviously some kind of meaning and significance to the fact that it's always read prior to Rosh Hashanah. There's some message, there's some lesson that we need to instill within ourselves in order to face Rosh Hashanah, so to speak. So what happens in this week's Parsha? It opens up, Atem Nitzavim Hayon Kulchem L'fnei Hashem Elokeichem. Moshe Rabbeinu tells the Bnei Yisrael that here you are, you're all standing before Hashem. And the pasuk proceeds to itemize and enumerate 10 different types of levels, stations, occupations. Rashechem, Shiftechem, the leaders, the heads of communities, the elders, and then it gives a cross spectrum. Tapchem and Rashechem, the wives and the children, Mechote veitzecha ad shov memecha, from those who are the wood choppers to those who are the water carriers. So in a sense, we have the entire socioeconomic, social strata, from the most dignified, distinguished of the community to those who are, their livelihood is from the most physical and menial labor. Men, women, children. Everybody was present at this address, at this gathering. And this was a gathering that the Torah specifies and emphasizes that every single person was there. By itemizing and enumerating every single position, vocation, occupation, the Torah wants us to know that at this address, everybody was there. And it's quite unique in that we don't find that at any moment or at any event prior to this does the Torah make mention. Not when they were leaving Mitzrayim or they at the time of Matan Torah. Although our midrash, our tradition does tell us that at Matan Torah everyone was present and even the future generations, but the Torah doesn't clearly specify that, doesn't mention that overtly in the Torah Shebektav, in the written Torah. And here the Torah is saying at this event, everybody arrived, everyone was there. Now, what was the purpose of this gathering? So the Torah says, Moshe is telling them, La'avracha bebris, this event is to bring you all to enter into a covenant with Hashem. What was essentially the covenant here? So the truth is there already was a covenant at Matan Torah. At Matan Torah, there was a special relationship that was formed between the Jewish people and Hashem. The Torah was the contract. But yet, here, there was a new layer. There are different opinions exactly what was the difference, but one of the perspectives that are given here is that what was introduced in this covenant was the notion of arevut, guarantorship, which means this became a covenant of mutual responsibility, that all Jews are responsible for each other, just like a regular arev, a regular guarantor. So what you have is a person, let's say Reuven, borrows money from Shimon, and Levi is the guarantor. In other words, Reuven borrows $100, and Levi guarantees Shimon that he will receive his $100 back. If Reuven doesn't pay, then Levi has to pay, because it's as if Levi owes the money, because he took that responsibility upon himself to ensure, to backstop that loan. And in a similar way, all the Jews became mutually responsible for one another. As the Midrash tells us, the famous analogy of a bundle. You have this aguda, this bundle of reeds. When they are all together, it is impossible to break them. When you have this, when they're all together. However, if one of them gets separated from the pack, then even a child could break it because it is very soft and vulnerable. And in a similar way, all of the Jewish people, the Medrash says, they will all be redeemed when they are all as one aguda, as one unit, as one bundle. Now, this is not just a nice symbolic idea, how we are all responsible for each other. We are all, in a sense, guaranteeing the well-being of another Jew, that is to say, in a spiritual sense, in addition to the physical responsibility. But there's actually, this concept has a halachic ramification. That is to say, this powerful idea is not just an abstract concept, but in fact, it has practical application. The concept of guarantorship, of mutual responsibility, the way it reflects in halacha. And that is, when it comes to example, the concept of kiddush, right? So there's a commandment, there's a mitzvah to recite kiddush on Shabbos. Now, let's say a person already recited kiddush. They were at shul, they made kiddush, and then they come home. So now there's the family, and there are those at the home, at the house that did not recite or hear kiddush. So if this person who was in shul already recited kiddush, now he comes home. He already fulfilled his mitzvah. So now, what is one to do? There are people in the home. May you recite the kiddush for them? Halacha says that you are allowed to recite the kiddush with a bracha. You're saying Hashem's name. It's a very, very serious thing. So the question is, how could you do that? You already recited kiddush. If you make kiddush once in shul, you're not allowed to just, if you make once and do it again, it's a bracha levatala. Why are you allowed to make kiddush a second time? The answer is, and this is brought in the Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe clearly elucidates this idea. That is because you already heard kiddush, you already discharged and fulfilled your obligation. However, there's another Jew who has not yet fulfilled their mitzvah. So since they didn't fulfill the mitzvah, to a certain degree, it's as if you didn't fulfill your mitzvah. And since you didn't fulfill the mitzvah, therefore you're allowed to make kiddush for them. And this is true not just for kiddush, for many other mitzvot, which we can help out for another person. Now, to be sure, it doesn't apply to all mitzvahs because it depends what the intent, the nature of the mitzvah was at the outset. There are certain mitzvahs that we call mitzvos shebaguf. That is to say, the mitzvah is incumbent that the person themselves do it. So, for example, if you want to eat a piece of cake, right, you need to make a bracha. Someone else is not allowed to discharge you of your obligation. Is not able to do that because you have to make the bracha. Or if it's a mitzvah of putting on tefillin, no one can do it for you because you need to do it individually. However, when it comes to mitzvahs, that the idea is that the mitzvah should be performed, not necessarily by your body per se. However, you should be participating and involved in the mitzvah, and you are contributing to it, such as Kiddush, where you are sanctifying the Shabbos. So then we say that a person is able to, because of the nature of the interconnectedness and interdependence of the Jewish people, we say that someone, even though they already heard the bracha or did the bracha, recited the bracha, so they could help you out because since you are lacking, it's as if they are lacking. This is true in the positive sense, where in a mitzvah or other areas in life where the arvus, this guarantorship, expresses itself in halacha. But the true is also in the inverse. That is to say, also in the negative, that not only my positive deeds could help for another person, but also the negative. When someone does something, it affects not only themselves, but other people as well. We know famously that when the Jewish people entered Eretz Yisrael and they, with the battle of Yericho, so Yoshua, there was a ban of taking any spoils, and there was this fellow over there whose name was Achan, and despite the ban, the cherem, he took from the spoils, and because of that, there were many people who died, not directly linked. They didn't do anything wrong, but ultimately there was the fact that they knew about it. They didn't say anything, and it says, as it says in the Torah, in the Chokosai, in the Tochachav, there says that one person will stumble because of their brother, and the Talmud says we see Kol Yisrael Ravim Zebeza, all Jews are mutually responsible for each other. So here it wasn't just in the positive, even in the negative, that when you see something, it affects somebody else. If you do something bad, and if you witness something happening and you don't protest, so that person's actions directly impact yours as well. We know the famous mashal that's brought, and it's based on the midrash of the person who was going on the boat, and the person they were going out into the sea, and this person decided they wanted to get a waterfront view. The person didn't pay for the first class ticket that you get to see the water, so he begins to drill under his seat, and the person next to him says, "What are you doing?" He says, "Well, over here I can't see much. We're all the way in the lowest cabins in the cellar over here. I can't see nothing. I want to be able to see the water." And he begins drilling, and he says, "What are you doing? You're going to sink us all." He says, "What do you mean? I purchased my ticket. I could do whatever I want under my seat." And he says, "True, this is your ticket and it's your seat, but you're drilling the hole. It impacts and affects everyone else." And indeed, this is the case, that the actions of every single person, we don't exist in a vacuum in an island, but in fact, our actions, our deeds directly affect and impact those around us. And I believe it's this story in the Talmud we've mentioned before about Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, how he had a debate with the sages as to whether a cow that has these ritzuot, these straps that the animal they would have as a harness. And there was a debate: is the animal allowed to go out with it on Shabbos or not? In any case, there was this debate, and Rabbi Eliezer was of the opinion that it was permitted. Nevertheless, the Chachamim, they're the majority. The halacha was like them. And one time he observed a neighbor who allowed their animal to go out on Shabbos. We're commanded on that the animals are not supposed to carry, and he observed how the animal is going out with that ritzua around its horns, which according to him was permissible, but the Chacham said it was not permissible, and he did not protest, he did not say anything. And later, he came to regret it, to the extent that it says he fasted so much that his teeth became blackened. In other words, Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah appreciated, he understood that his lack of protest was a form of acquiescence, and therefore he felt personally responsible for not having prevented or at least protested this person's actions. So ultimately, we see this concept of arvus, and to circle back to what we were talking about, this idea of atem nitzavim, the beginning of this week's parsha, is that Moshe Rabbeinu is bringing the Jewish people into a covenant of mutual responsibility. Now, this was ultimately a big revolution, was a big, big change, because until this point, if you study the Torah, you could perhaps see in various instances a certain trend. When you had good people and bad people, and sometimes they were in each other's company, what was the approach? It was one of disengagement from those who sinned. Go back to the beginning of, in the Parsha of Lech Lecha, where you have Avram and Lot, and there were the shepherds of Avram and Lot, and they're pasturing, and they observe there was a conflict because the shepherds of Lot, they're not muzzling their animals, and their animals are eating from the fields of other people, and it was theft, and it became a problem. What does Avram tell Lot? He says, "Listen, I see it's not working out. You decide. If you go left, I'll go right. If you go right, I'll go left." So Avram essentially realizes that he can't live with his nephew, and therefore they have to go separate ways. Or if we look at the story of Yishmael, where Sarah observes that Hagar is raising this Yishmael, and she's not happy with she's afraid it'll be a bad influence. She doesn't want it to be the heir to Avram. In any case, she sends him away. doesn't want him to have a negative impact on Yitzchak. Or Esav and Yaakov, again, he had his own home. He lived with his wives, and the idolatry and the incense and the smoke and all of that was in a different place. There was no engagement. There was no attempt. They went to a different land in the Har Seir, and that was something else. However, what's happening here? In this instance, there's a concept of mutual responsibility. When you see another Jew who is slipping and sliding, it's instead of saying, you know what, let's write this person off, let's sever the relationship. In fact, we say no. We actually bring them in, and we are, as a Jewish people, we are all one body. Now, just to mention, this we read about this covenant in this week's parsha. Right, this is in fact, it says that Moshe Rabbeinu, this is right before his passing, but the covenant only went into effect once they went into Eretz Yisrael. And it says they went to the two mountains, Har Gerizim and Har Evel, half of the Shvatim on one mountain and six on the other mountain, and they accepted it with an oath and all the tochacha, etc. So it only went into effect later. However, prior to entering Eretz Yisrael, this was one of the final acts of Moshe Rabbeinu. So what's the point? What are we trying to accomplish here? On a simple level, one can say that this is a sort of a defense pact. It's like an alliance. You know, you have like NATO and other alliances where we're trying to protect ourselves. The Jewish people are a very small, fragile nation, and they've been persecuted. And we ultimately need to feel that we are there for each other to protect each other. So we put this covenant in place, which mutually assures every person that someone's going to have your back. On a simple level, we can understand that. And of course, we know that that's a certain sense of comfort. We know wherever we go, we're part of a mishpacha, we're part of a community. Geography doesn't make a difference. The demographic doesn't make a difference. We all know we are all in it together. And indeed, it's not just the way we perceive ourselves that way, but others who perceive us. And that is on one level. We could see that. However, there's a deeper level over here. When we say the concept of Kol Yisrael Arevim Zabaza, Arev means a guarantor, as we mentioned. But Arev could also mean something else. Arev could have the same etymology as Iruv, which means mixture. Something that is intermingled, interdependent. That all the Jewish people, all of the neshamot, are all bound up and linked as part of one soul. There's the soul, the primordial soul, the general soul of Adam HaRishon, and this general soul encompasses all of the neshamot, all of the souls of the subsequent generations. So in the Kabbalistic and Hasidic perspective, we look at the Jewish people as one big cosmic body. And a body has many, many different facets. There's the head, different organs, different limbs, sinews, veins, etc. So each one individually is, you can look at it and see that individual facet and detail. However, they all comprise one big body. And therefore, when we look at it, we see a certain mosaic. Person's not going to say, well, there's the head, this is very, very important, the eyes, but okay, so you could deal, you don't have a hand, you don't have a foot, you don't have other limbs. We look at a body and we see many, many details, but they all are part of one organic oneness. It's one unit. It's many, many details, but ultimately we look at a body as one single entity. In a similar way, we look at all the neshamas, each individually. There are those who are more lofty, that originate in more sublime levels in the spiritual chain of evolution. But ultimately, each Jew is indispensable and inextricably part of one collective mosaic. And therefore, when we look at every single Jew, just like the head, we'll say, okay, the foot hurts, it's not my problem. We know that there are veins and nerve systems that directly link all parts of the body to the head, to the heart, to the brain, wherever it may be. So the well-being of each organ, of each limb, is relevant and vital to every part of the body. I just read this story. There was this person, his name was Reb Aaron Derendovich, who was an educator in England. And he speaks about how when he was young, his father was very, very ill. And he was ill for a certain period of time. And his father had a very close friend whose name was Reb Yisrael Rudzinski. And he came to visit him for some time. And then at some point, mysteriously, his father's health improved. And he lived to a decent age. And subsequently, his father became ill again, and he passed away. And it was at the Shiva. He says that this fellow, Reb Yisrael, who was the colleague, a friend of his father, a very close friend of his father, came to be Menachem Avol at the Shiva. And he says, I want to tell you something about your father. He says, your father and I were very close friends. We were together in the war together, and we made it through the camps. And we made our way to England. And then suddenly, at one point, your father, he became very, very ill. And the doctors said that they were examining him, and they said that the only way he could survive is if they do a very risky procedure. But if they go ahead and do this procedure, there's a very big chance that he won't make it. So it's a lose-lose situation. And your father was getting ill and sicker every single day. But he didn't know what to do. So we were talking together, and we decided that what we're going to do is we're going to write a letter to 23 of the great Jewish leaders and personalities of our generation, and ask them, what does the Torah say? What is the right approach? Should we do the procedure? Should we not do the procedure? They said, we wrote 23 letters, and we did not get a response from a single one, except one person responded. One of the people who we wrote to was the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And the Rebbe writes back that I hear about what you're going through, and says the words of Torah. The Rebbe says, I can't give you direct advice on this, what to do necessarily, but I heard from my father-in-law, the Frierdiker Rebbe, that one who strengthens in their Torah study, it's a segula for refuah. So I recommend that you study the daily portion of the Chitas, the Chumash, Tehillim, and Tanya, the daily Torah portion that was instituted by my father-in-law, the Frierdiker Rebbe, and that should be a merit for you to have a refuah shlema. So this fellow, the colleague of the father, he calls back and he says, I got your letter, I understand. However, this fellow is this patient is very, very ill. He is not even in a position to study the chitas every day. He's simply too ill to do it. And the Rebbe said back, he says, okay, listen, if he can't do it, fine. But if a friend of his is able to study it, that will also be a great merit. And in any case, he says, well, right away, I took upon myself that I'm going to study the chitas every single day. And surely enough, within a week, your father's condition began to improve, getting better and better, until he was completely healed. And the doctors were astonished, totally shocked. There was no need for an operation, for a procedure, or anything like that. And he lived a very healthy life until recently he got ill and he passed away again. He says, I want you to know I've been studying the chitas for 40 years. Every single day, I have not missed a single day. And I want you to know that your father, you didn't know you were a child, and that's why he was ill, and then suddenly he got better. It didn't just happen by itself. It was in the schus, in the merit of the Rebbe's bracha, and the study of chitas. But what's fascinating about this story is here you have a situation where one Jew studies Torah and another Jew gets better. His health improves, which it teaches us a very, very powerful thing. I mean, what's the connection? This guy's learning and he's getting better because Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh means something very, very powerful. It's not just, I'm going to look out for you if you're going through a hard time. I'm going to give you a loan, I'll give you a shout out, I'll give you a hug. It means that ultimately what I do, you and I are truly one. Because if we look at the bodies, we seem different, disparate, differentiated. But when we go to the source, our neshama, it comes from the same place. So you and I are truly one. So if I study Torah, it helps you. You study Torah, it helps me. And this explains to get to the question about Rosh Hashanah, the connection between Atim Nitzavim, Parsha of Nitzavim and Rosh Hashanah. We find a very curious thing when it comes to Rosh Hashanah. In general, we know that when it comes to the holidays, to the Yom Tovim, the Chagim, there is a difference between the way the Chag is celebrated, the Yom Tov is celebrated in Eretz Yisrael, and the way it's celebrated in Chutz La'aretz in the diaspora. In the diaspora, every Yom Tov is 2 days. If it's Sukkot, we have the first 2 days, and the Shmini Atzeret, Simchas Torah, the second 2 days, Pesach, the first 2 days, and Acharon Shel Pesach, Shvi Shel Pesach, and Achron Shel Pesach. There's one place where we don't see that difference, and that's why when it comes to in Eretz Yisrael, it's only 1 day. When it comes to Sukkot, it's one day. When it comes to the second days of Sukkot, Pesach, they're eating chametz while we're still sitting and chewing on the matzah. However, there's one place where is Eretz Yisrael and the Chutz La'aretz are the same, and that is when it comes to Rosh Hashanah. In Eretz Yisrael, they also celebrate 2 days. Now, it's an interesting discussion why it is this way. And briefly, the truth is, the Rebbe mentions that we see this idea. It wasn't something that was invented recently. If we even go back to the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, which was over 2,500 years ago, when the Jewish people returned from the Galus, from the exile of Bavel. It was a very difficult time in Jewish history. They were very assimilated, intermarried. They've been in Galus, it was their first Galus. They've been in exile for quite some time. They were intermarried, not Jewish children, and they were coming back to Eretz Yisrael. And it says it was on Rosh Hashanah where they read from Ezra and Nehemiah, they read from the Torah, and it sort of gave us an inspiration for many, many Jewish people. They were crying and they wanted to do teshuvah. And it is that time Nehemiah tells them in the famous words that he tells the Jewish people, don't mourn. Rosh Hashanah is not a day of sadness and crying. Ichlu mashmanim ushtumam takim. It's a day that you should eat delicacies. And this is Kadosh Hayom Ladanenu, because this is a holy day for Hashem. This is one of the sources that Rosh Hashanah, it's a celebratory feast. But then he tells them, go home and rejoice, but come back tomorrow. And the next day they came back, and again, he prepared them for the Chag of Sukkot that was upcoming. So we see that the Jewish people celebrated 2 days. This is the Rebbe's explanation, how we see even in those days in Eretz Yisrael, they celebrated 2 days of Yom Tov on Rosh Hashanah. Now, on a technical level, the reason is because the way it worked in the temple times, the holidays were established not based on the calendar like we have today. You just look on the calendar, when is Rosh Hashanah, when is Sukkot, when is Pesach. It was based on the sanctification of the moon, which was observed by 2 witnesses. So the 2 witnesses had to see the emergence of the new moon, and they would come to Besdin and they would be interrogated. And once it had been confirmed and determined that they indeed saw the new moon, they would declare that it was Rosh Chodesh. So the problem was that in those days, they had no emails and WhatsApp and text messages, so they couldn't just call up and say, hey, we saw the moon. So the truth is, Rosh Chodesh could, on a typical month, could happen on one of 2 days. It could either be on the 30th of the end of the month, or it could be the 1st of the next month. So it's like it's Elul, it could either be Lamed Elul or Aleph Tishrei. Now, in order, if the witnesses didn't see the moon on the 30th, then Rosh Chodesh would be a second day. Rosh Chodesh would be on the 1st. Now, what would happen is once they would determine, let's say it was Rosh Chodesh, they would have to go and travel and notify all the people. And since let's say it's Tishrei, the people who are living far away from Eretz Yisrael, how would they know that it is Rosh Chodesh? They wouldn't know. And if they don't know when Rosh Chodesh is, how do they know when Sukkot is, which is 2 weeks later? It would take more than 2 weeks for the witness, once it was established in Bezdin, to send people to travel and notify everyone that it's Rosh Chodesh. So what do? So therefore, the people in the diaspora, they had to celebrate 2 days, because maybe Rosh Chodesh was on the second day, not on the first day. And because of that, in all of the diaspora, it was the Yom Tovim were typically 2 days. And even today, which we know when Rosh Chodesh is, because we don't do it based on the cycle of the moon, we do it based on the calculation that was established in the 1st century by Hillel the Elder. But still, we observe the minhag of our ancestors, and therefore Yom Tov is 2 days. But this is only in the diaspora. If you lived in Eretz Yisrael, so let's say they knew which day Rosh Chodesh was, so they could get on a horse and they could reach even the furthest place. Let's say they're going from Yerushalayim to Tzfas, they're going to Eilat, or wherever they are. They would be able in a couple days to notify everyone in Eretz Yisrael that it's Rosh Chodesh. If you live in Europe somewhere, they have to get on a boat. It would take a few weeks, so they wouldn't get there in time for Yom Tov. But if you're in Eretz Yisrael, let's say it's Nisan, and you know that Aleph Nisan is Rosh Chodesh, so they could make it anywhere by the time Pesach would come around. But this is only true Pesach or Sukkot. How about Rosh Hashanah? What's if the witnesses didn't come on the first day of Rosh Chodesh and there's a second day of Rosh Chodesh? How would the people know? The problem is, you'll say, well, go on the horse and travel. You get there in 1 day. There's a concept of tchum. You're not allowed to go outside the tchum. You're not allowed to go outside the city limit on Yom Tov, just like Shabbos. So the Eidim, the agents of the Bezdin, wouldn't be able to notify people throughout Israel what's going on in Yerushalayim, where the Bezdin is. So therefore, they established that Rosh Hashanah, even in Israel, will be 2 days. And since they did it like that in those days, even today, we have Rosh Hashanah 2 days, both in Israel and in the diaspora. So that's the legalistic, technical explanation. But what's the deeper meaning here? The deeper meaning here is there's something about the fact that Rosh Hashanah is 2 days everywhere, both in Eretz Yisrael and diaspora. It's brought in the Zohar that when it says the word Hayom, it refers to a very Hayom, today. There's something very, very special about the word today. Whenever it says the word today, Hayom, it's referring to the day of judgment, the day of law. We find that in other places, and ultimately what it's referring to is thus, when it says in this week's Parsha, Atem Nitzavim Hayom, Hayom is referring to a day of judgment, the day of Rosh Hashanah. So what the Torah is telling us, that what is the significance that we stand before Hashem, Atem Nitzavim Hayom L'fnei Hashem Elokechem, you stand before Hashem, that every single year, in order to stand in judgment, we all have to be together. Moshe Rabbeinu gathers all the Jewish people, as we mentioned, from all sides of the spectrum, from across the spectrum. Because when we want to be judged, how do we want to be judged? We want to be judged when we're all together. You don't want to be judged alone. Alone, we are vulnerable, our flaws, our deficiencies may become apparent. In this month, in the month of Tishrei, we seek to renew and reestablish a very important principle. On the one hand, we are coming to Hashem in a gesture of teshuvah, of reconciliation. However, we are saying is that this is all going to happen in the context of unity, as we all come together as one. So Rosh Hashanah, we have 2 days, both in the diaspora, also in Eretz Yisrael. Because ultimately what we're saying is, it cannot be that here in the diaspora, on the second day, we are being scrutinized and judged. And in Israel, they're sitting and driving around and enjoying life. It can't be that way. The Rebbe explains that the fact that Rosh Hashanah, both in Eretz Yisrael and here, we both celebrate 2 days because this expresses the unity, the Atim Nitzavim, that we are demonstrating to Hashem that when our brother stands in judgment, we stand together with him, because ultimately we are truly one. And in fact, the Rebbe explained once that it's customary after the evening service, we say on Rosh Hashanah by night, it's customary, and it mentions it in the Siddur, it's customary to greet our fellow and say, L'shana Tova, Tikasei v'seichasei, or Tikasevi v'seichaseini. It's customary to greet each other with this special blessing for Hashanah Tov, which is a fascinating thing, because we don't find in the Siddur, in the instructions, when it's Friday night, go wish your colleague, your friend, your fellow shul member, good Shabbos, Shabbat Shalom, or on Yom Tov, go tell your friend, Chag Sameach, good Yom Tov. It doesn't say that, but specifically on Rosh Hashanah, it says that we should go to greet each person. It says, L'shana Tov. What's the idea? Because ultimately, what are we saying? What is this judgment? The day of judgment on Rosh Hashanah is not just who you are. What have you done with yourself in your own self-enhancement and self-perfection, your own self-realization? Rather, the question is on Rosh Hashanah, what have you done with another person? How many Jews have you brought in? How many people have you reached out to, thought about, cared about? Someone who needs help, someone who's down, someone who needs a meal, especially in the Chagim, where everyone, it's all about the family and being people together. Maybe there's someone who's going through a difficult time. Have you thought about someone maybe that we have slighted or made them feel uncomfortable in a certain way? So in all of our preparations, what is the best thing we could do for Rosh Hashanah? Of course, we scrutinize and introspect. How is our davening? How is our study? But ultimately, the Nitzavim, the biggest bracha, when we stand before Hashem, what is the best way to be judged is when we are all together, when we are truly together, when we reveal that innate oneness, the organic unity that pervades through all of us as a Jewish community. And it is then we say, Barcheinu Avinu Kol Nekachad, Hashem gives us that bracha. And there was there was a chassid, his name was Reb Moshe Slanim, who was an educator in Eretz Yisrael, and he would have this custom. Every single Rosh Hashanah, he was very involved with various education, people in the government who were working in education. He was a big educator, and he had a whole school network that he would run. So he was involved with various people in the Ministry of Education who were secular. He would invite them for Rosh Hashanah and have them over and entertain them at his Yom Tov table. And every year he would watch as he would leave the shul. There was others who would stay and they would daven with greater arichos, with more intensity. They would study some Hasidic discourse, and he felt, it's Rosh Hashanah. This is such a holy day. Why am I going home and entertaining these people who are totally out of it? It's better, maybe I should just stay in shul and really just connect to the day. And one year he decided, that's it. I'm not inviting any of these guests. He arranged that they have other places to go. He found other hosts for them like this. At least for 1 year, he'd be free and clear. And he begins to study a Hasidic discourse and is davening at greater length. And he wants to really get into it. All of a sudden, it's after davening, and he's really going to stay there. He's not going to go home. He notices at the doorway, there's this young couple that are standing there. And he goes over to them and says, how can I help you? They says, well, we were just driving on the highway and we decided to come in here and see what's going on. We know it's Rosh Hashanah. We were just curious to learn about it. And right away he understood that for him, Rosh Hashanah is not just about himself. He realized already that this is his shluchus. He's going to have to, he goes over, he closes his sefer, he closes his siddur, and he says, come with me. And he takes them home. Because he understood that it's great to pray at great length and with kavanah and all of that. But not less important is to ensure that every single Jew is able to stand before Hashem. So may it be Hashem's will that Eretz Hashem this year, that all of us should have a ksiva tova, be inscribed for a good, happy, and healthy year with gesund, with great health, parnasa, with nachas, with all the good things, and may we merit very soon the speedy arrival, the coming of Mashiach, Meher of Yameinu, Amen.